record starting now, so we have this available after.
Cool.
So the overall topic today is consent in the digital age. But starting at the basics, could you speak into what consent is?
Yeah. You declined the ring that was just happening. Apologies for that. So consent is an agreement between people that confirms a mutual willingness to have a shared experience. So it's a shared experience, not just a physical activity, but a shared experience. And then you kind of feel into yourself, like, do I have a willingness to do this? And then the consent happens when there's the agreement between the people. So it's expressed in some way. Um, and to a shared experience, it can be given and received. So we, in addition to teaching people how to articulate consent or refusal, we also in our prevention work articulate how to receive someone's consent or refusal in a way that isn't manipulative or coercive. And it can also be given or withheld. So you can refuse, right? The whole point of giving consent is that you also know that you have the freedom to refuse the shared experience if you want.
Awesome. So how does that kind of differ in an online setting? Because I feel like we usually talk about consent in terms of like in person.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times our online spaces tend to be less facilitated, right? There's not as much facilitation as our in-person spaces. A lot of spaces are considered to be more just like public or free for all, and people are there, and there might be less structure to it. There may be less clarity on norms and agreements. We also don't have as many of the social cues that typically signal safety or red flags. So when we're lacking visuals, when we don't get to hear tone of voice, or when we can't see facial expressions, it might be harder to read what's happening. So you may not have those social cues, which usually those social cues can create a little bit of safety in us when we have that uh-oh feeling that we can respond to. It's also harder to read tone in online spaces. And one of the ways that that can make consent hard is that we're more likely to second guess ourselves. When we don't read someone's tone, we're like, maybe they didn't mean it that way. Did they mean it that way? And then when someone sees that hesitancy, they might choose to exploit that our second guessing of ourselves. I think another thing that plays into it is that there can be some distance or anonymity in online settings, and that can be good. I mean, that anonymity and the freedom in online spaces can be really wonderful. So an example of that being a good thing is for some folks with disabilities, or people who are geographically isolated, having access to online spaces can really help them navigate things in a different way, maybe a little slower, have a little more healthy pacing to it. If you're geographically isolated or have a lot of anxiety, then having social settings that are available to you online can help actually feel good and reduce isolation and reduce some of that anxiety. And then sometimes we have people who have identities that aren't as common in their everyday communities. So when that happens, they may not be able to connect with other people who look like them or who have similar identities and experiences in their everyday lives. And so online access and online connections give them a chance to meet other people who have shared experiences and can understand where they're coming from that they might not have otherwise, which can be life-saving. But also, sometimes that anonymity contributes to behaviors that we might not otherwise see in people, like bullying, where they think the rules don't apply to this setting, or sometimes when they just fail to remember that it's a real live human on the other end. We forget the humanity of the people who we're interacting with, and some of that might be due to not having those social cues, but some of that might be just due to having that distance. You know, you don't have to stick around to see the fallout of someone that you've hurt. And then it can be really bad when there's unsolicited sexual harassment or sexual content that's sent that's unsolicited and non-consensual, when we have things like grooming happening or misrepresentation of who people are or what their intentions are. And then also non-consensual sharing of sexually explicit media. And that can be non-consensually sharing media that you take of someone, but that could be that someone shared a sexually explicit image consensually and then it gets reshared non-consensually. Also, sometimes we see people online in these online spaces impersonate others for the purposes of bullying or harassing them, which is also an unacceptable behavior.
Right. As the world suddenly went virtual throughout the pandemic, creating safe spaces kind of had to shift gears a little bit. So how can people create safe spaces in an online setting?
Yeah. So I think in general, in all of these settings, a lot of the literature is telling us that the online bullying, harassment, violence that we see is typically just an extension of things that are happening in people's everyday lives. People who are bullying and aggressive and sending unsolicited sexual content online often are doing the same things in their everyday lives as well. And so, what we want to do is find ways to bring our existing safety frameworks, including things like consent, boundaries, bystander intervention, normalizing talking about consent and sexuality, safety. How do we create safety? How do we define safety? Power dynamics. How do we address racism and homophobia and transphobia? We want to think about how do we address these things in our everyday lives and in our teaching, and then how can we bring that into our online spaces? So um, you don't want to create programming that's just for online spaces. You want to take the same concepts that you use in our everyday work and then bring it into online spaces. So look at your existing programs, curricula, presentations, and look at the scenarios you're talking about and think, what does this look like online? Right? Like how does this apply online? If we're describing consent violations or sexual harassment, then what are some examples of how that might happen online? If we're talking about bystander intervention models, think about how do we intervene as bystanders online? And if we're also talking about things like relationship red flags, well, then think, what do red flags look like? Those same red flags when they happen in your DMs or in texting. We do also have like two kinds of online spaces, and some of them are pretty heavily curated. And I'm thinking in curation, like when we host a Zoom meeting at NCCASA, we have some curation and some control over it. If you're in like a Facebook group that has a good admin team and written rules and agreements, then there's some curated space. But sometimes there's less curated spaces where you just go and you're able to access people online. So you want to take different approaches. And in the curated spaces, we have more control. So having things like agreements, what are our group agreements, doing some safety planning, like what are our protocols for adding people to the group, for removing people from the group, what are our expectations when people are in the group, can we discuss these openly, like how do we address safety planning, how is power managed or shared in the group. That kind of helps us keep those curated spaces safe. But in those less curated spaces where you may be getting DMs or texts, and there's not a facilitator or a moderator, we want to remember boundaries still matter. It is still an expectation that we respect each other's boundaries, even if it's virtual or online. And we want to avoid dogpiling, and we also want to disrupt dogpiling, right? And dogpiling is what we refer to when there's a situation where someone maybe in a comment section makes a comment that shows that they have a different perspective, or they don't understand a concept, or they misrepresent a concept. And a few people start to respond, and then before long, more and more people respond in a rapid fire way that can sometimes escalate and become aggressive. So we want to avoid dogpiling, but we can also disrupt it. I saw a friend on Facebook recently that had someone in her comments who made a comment that was sort of not understanding a really important social justice concept. And my friend typed a good response and explained her position. And then someone else came in, and then a couple more people tried to respond, calling the person out. And my friend actually disrupted it and responded by saying, "Hey friends, I think we've given so and so enough food for thought for now. I'd like to avoid a dogpiling situation, so let's not comment anymore," which was beautiful. Um, we can also, in those non-curated spaces, ask for clarification when something feels off, instead of just jumping to conclusions or assuming tone. So ask for direct clarification if it feels safe to do so. We want to, even in our online spaces, name abusive behavior when it happens, and that includes racism and homophobia, transphobia, ableism. Name it and be like, this is unacceptable. Just like in all spaces that we're in, you want to trust yourself if something feels off. So if something feels like it's off and it's not right, it's okay for you to just bow out. It's okay for you to block someone. It's okay for you to not respond. So trust yourself if it doesn't feel right. And then the last thing I would say is sometimes slowing the pace can help with navigating consent in online spaces. Is just like, if it feels bad or overwhelming or confusing or out of character or hurtful, just slow the pace, because I think with us being tethered to our devices, which I am too, you get that text and you're like, oh, I must respond immediately. I must be available to this person at all times. I have to engage in real time. And sometimes it's okay to just be like, I don't have to respond to this right now. I can wait. I can wait till tomorrow. I can wait till next week and just take some time for me to get centered and grounded and feel out what I really want in this situation. That sometimes when we get in that rush to respond, we get swept up in an urgency that doesn't benefit our best ability to navigate consent. And that's true whether it's your ability to give or offer consent, or even if it's your ability to respect someone else's boundaries, and respect their consent.
Yeah, I definitely feel like throughout the pandemic, especially, it's been really hard to kind of like, for myself, even with creating boundaries with like, if, like you said, if I get a message on my phone, I kind of am just like, oh, I got to respond to this immediately. If I get an email, I'm like, I have to take care of it immediately. And, thinking about that, that's not really what real life experiences are like. Like, we're able to kind of take that time to just sit and process and take care of it like when we're ready to. So I think that that's a really great point that you're bringing up.
Yeah, and you can even tell someone that. And that's true in person, but even in our online spaces, again, it's something that applies in both. But you can even say, um, I'm not sure, I'm not really clear with myself on what I want right now. I think I want to sit on it and maybe get back to you tomorrow. Like,
Yeah.
you can tell someone that.
Yeah, I think that's something that is really good and something that we should maybe work on internalizing, because I know I have a really hard time saying no to things, but it's really important that, we get comfortable with saying, I need some time.
Yeah. And that goes for the person who's responding to the no. So one of the things that happens is you may get the no and feel rejected or anxious or like you need to fix it right then. And that might mean that either pushing back against the no, or it might mean trying to pretend like it never happened, like, oh, whatever, I didn't really want to do it. Like that sense of rejection that comes up when we hear the no. You can sit with that before you respond. So if you invite someone to do a thing and they're like, actually, I really don't want to, that may be bringing up some feelings in you that you feel like you need to type some kind of response right then. And sometimes that's not when you're going to do your best job of respecting someone's boundaries. So you can, even in those situations, take that pause to make sure that you're thinking about it. Or if someone says something that you just don't like or disagree with, right? Even if it's not telling you no to going to do something, if they say something you don't like or don't agree with, I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit hot-headed. So sometimes I want to be like, actually, allow me to explain. I kind of like want to fire off, but then then I run the risk of veering into online behavior that's causing harm, right? And I don't want that to be my contribution to online spaces I'm in. So that's even a good time to hit that pause button and get grounded and be like, I don't have to address this right now. If this
Yeah,
person is wrong today, they're still going to be wrong tomorrow if and when I choose to reply. And I can reply from a more grounded space. And I say that kind of facetiously. If I disagree with this person today, that's not going to go away overnight, but my activation about it might go away. It might ease.
right. We might be able to think through it and maybe like a more um, calm-headed space, because like I'm very quick to just be like, no, I have to address this like right now, when like that's not true. Like it's like you said, taking a pause and kind of incorporating that into like our daily grounding practices, I think is something that's really beneficial for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, in digital and in in-person spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So shifting gears a little bit, the theme for SAAM 2021, at least with NCCASA, is Let's Talk About It, which ties into a prevention campaign that NCCASA launched that you were actually a huge part of. Can you speak into the development of the Let's Talk About It campaign and what the intent is behind it?
Sure. So the Let's Talk About It campaign started just as it's a general NCCASA initiative. And originally we had gotten to talking about how sometimes we wait until people are older, almost adults or teenagers before we start talking about consent. And that means that by the time we want to talk about consent about sexual things where it's really, the stakes are high, that we don't have any practice in talking about consent. We don't have any practice in talking about bodily autonomy. And so the original video in the Let's Talk About It campaign just encourages people to have those conversations about consent at all ages. So even with little kids, we can talk about how your body is your own, and if you don't want to hug someone, you don't have to hug them, and you get to make the choices about your body that feel safe within, the choices that we're able to give you. And then as they get older, we continue that conversation even when it's a little bit awkward. And so that was the Let's Talk About It campaign. And then as this campaign was coming to form, we had started hosting for all of our RPE subrecipients um, a bi-weekly support Zoom call where we would get together and have conversations and share ideas about doing prevention work in this new pandemic reality. And a few of our RPE coordinators during one of those, we brought up online safety, and one of them brought up some campaigns that they had seen going around about digital safety that they didn't really like the approach. And I asked what they didn't like about the approach, and several of them shared that it it shows young people, like adolescents, who don't know anything about anything ever and are so easily duped and have no idea what's happening. And it shows perpetrators who are just like completely creepy, stereotypes. And it shows parents engaging in just overly punitive responses to their kids having unsafe experiences online, to their kids being frightened online, and then they get punished by a parent. um, so they said that they were seeing this and they're like, this doesn't look like it keeps communication open. So the first thing we did is I had them give me all the feedback about what messaging they thought would help. And we created a document called Helping Youth Stay Safe Online, which you can find on NCCASA's prevention page. And it's available in English and Spanish. And it's about just keeping the dialogue open. It's called Opening the Dialogue, Helping Youth Stay Safe Online. And they said, as we had that conversation, I mentioned to them that I have a teenager, and my teenage daughter, within a week of getting on Instagram, had gotten follow requests from weird profiles and at least 3 creepy DMs. And this is a 13-year-old, just turned 13, just got on Instagram, and in less than a week was getting creeper DMs. And she brought them to me and showed them to me and was like, what is this? Look at this creeper. And she recognized that it was off. And we were able to have these conversations about what that meant. And our RPE subrecipients were like, that's the video we want to see. Like, we want to see the video that shows a young person recognizing that something feels off and reaching out for support. We want to see a video where someone goes to someone that they trust, whether it's a peer or a parent, or some other trusted adult, and says, hey, this doesn't feel right. And the parent, instead of saying, do this, this, and this, and by the way, I'm throwing your phone in the toilet and you're never getting on Instagram again. Instead of that the parent's like, hey, this is hard, but the parent kind of like gets centered and grounded in themselves and is able to respond in a loving and compassionate way that keeps the conversation open so they can work together on solutions. So later last year, we had an opportunity to make 2 of those videos. And so that's where we started expanding the Let's Talk About It campaign into some specific online safety prevention work. And we have videos. We have 2 different videos now that are available. And one of them is of a young person who gets a creepy DM from someone and goes to his mother to speak to his mom about it, and they have a conversation. And what I love about that video is that even the mother, you hear her inner narrative, and she's like, I'm not gonna lie, when I saw this DM, I was a little freaked out, but I realized this was an opportunity. We want to acknowledge that for a parent, it's scary. When my kid showed me those DMs, I was like, oh my gosh, like I was terrified. And also, having a reality where our kids don't interact online is just not realistic in this year. It's 2021. That just doesn't make sense. Then in the other video that we created, there's a teenager who gets a creepy message and reaches out and has a FaceTime with a friend. And they're able to validate it's okay to have boundaries. You don't owe anyone your time. You can block and delete if you need to. Like, it's okay for you to do what feels good for you. And so we wanted these videos, and then we created a facilitator's guide. So the facilitator's guide has sample social media language for someone who wants to reshare those videos online. And it also has discussion questions. So it can be used for groups of adolescents, and there's discussion questions for use in an all youth setting. It has discussion questions for youth for dialogue with adults. And so that could be used with parents, caregivers, and other trusted adults to kind of like have conversations about how to show up as a trusted adult in a way that keeps the dialogue open. And then we thought it would be super cool if we could have like an intergenerational dialogue. So we do even have discussion questions for use in like families or intergenerational settings, where not only are we talking about online safety and navigating social media, but we're talking about things like, why is social media hard for families to talk about? Why is online safety, what makes it harder for families to communicate openly about online safety? What makes it easier so we can actually have that meta conversation about how to keep communication open? So it's a pretty exciting campaign. And I think the intent is, instead of trying to scare people away from social media, to help model empowered responses. We want to model youth who are able to learn what some of these red flags are and be like, this doesn't feel right, and like do something about it and start learning how to advocate for themselves. And we want to model trusted adults and peers supporting them and advocating for themselves. We want to show what we do want to happen instead of showing what we don't want to happen.
Yeah, like you said, I feel like it's really easy for people in kind of like those guardianship roles, those parent roles, where if something scary happens online, it feels like the initial reaction should be to just shut it all down. Just like if you delete everything and if you're not online, then nothing can happen to you. But
Right.
I like what you said about viewing it instead as an opportunity to kind of start those conversations and start dialogues, because we're in the year 2021 and like everybody's online, and we just kind of have to think about how we can go about online interactions like in a safe way. And I think what you had said about starting those conversations with even your friends or with your parents, I feel like is a really great opportunity for these kind of conversations to start spreading more widestream.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that the two videos we do have, it is more of a stranger DM that's unusual, but one of the things when we focus too, and we do have future videos in mind that would be someone that the young person knows, right? Showing online safety with people who you know. But a lot of times when we focus so much on stranger danger in our online programming, and that's all we talk about, instead of talking about boundaries and navigating digital consent, if we're just like, strangers are horrible on the internet, don't talk to them. First of all, we're excluding those populations I mentioned earlier: people with disabilities, people with anxiety, people with identities that maybe they don't have access to other people with those lived experiences. We're pushing them out of our dialogue. But the other thing that happens is we fail to notice that studies show that a lot of that harassment that's happening online is an extension of real life harassment. So if person A is bullying person B at school, then there's a good chance that if they're both on social media, person A is bullying person B online, right? It's the same people. It's an extension of an online experience. So when we focus too much on stranger danger, it's just like past campaigns for child sexual abuse that focused on stranger danger in prevention, that fails to acknowledge that a lot of times we know our abusers and we know who assaulted us. Similarly, a lot of times we know who sent us that unsolicited sexual imagery, or that exposed us to online sexual images without our consent, or who is exploiting or building that grooming online. Sometimes it's the same person that's grooming you in person.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really good noting, is that I feel like so often we have this image of the stranger hiding in the bush, just like waiting to jump out, and kind of like similar with online situations where it's the creepy stranger who just created a profile and is now messaging everybody, when there's a really good chance that we do know somebody. And I feel like that example you shared was a really great one to demonstrate how this isn't just about online spaces. It all ties in together and it all works together.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so important to talk about. Instead of talking about online safety in a vacuum, we have to be talking about things like boundaries and consent, which is why I love the topic for this interview, is that we're talking about like, what does consent look like? Like, how do we navigate consent? How do we navigate boundaries? Because a lot of times it's the same issues as in person. So talking about boundaries, consent, respecting someone's no, those are all things that apply in any setting.
Yeah. So do you have any other final thoughts that you want to share before we open it up to questions? It can be about anything in regards to prevention, advocacy, awareness, anything that you have.
I think one thing, this is an interesting direction we might go in the future with some of these, is that remembering that in online spaces, sometimes certain kinds of online spaces can have a banter, to where there may be some teasing that's part of the culture. I'm thinking specifically of things like gaming, or in certain groups where there's a little bit of trash talking. And so I think one of the things that I really want to see brought into our consent dialogue is that sometimes we consent to a little bit of good-natured teasing. And also we can still set boundaries if it goes too far. So just keeping in mind that it's not always an all or nothing, that sometimes if you enjoy a little bit of banter or of showing off a little bit, or trash talking, that you can still ask for it to stop if it crosses a threshold, that you still have that right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can kind of be a mixture, and that's okay. It's just something that's very natural and it flows.
Yep.
All right, so that was all of the questions that I had. If anybody has questions in the audience, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can pop them in the chat and we will discuss them.
Hi, my name is Brittany. How are you, ladies? So I
Hey.
just have a question. You guys have been talking a lot of the consent and how talk about like adolescents to parents, families, and all that. But how? So I work in the military, and I have a lot of soldiers under me that are 18, 19 years old, even though they are adult now. Is there a part of the let's talk about a campaign where it can be an open up, not like adolescent to parent or vice versa, that would help us to um, have the soldiers realize like, hey, you can speak up if something does happen or you do feel uncomfortable getting this unsolicited uh, messages or pictures from other higher up enlisted or even your peer soldiers that you don't really want getting into your Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a lot of our let's talk about it resources that we've made so far. So the one thing I can say is this is a relatively new campaign. We just started it last year, and we just made these 2 prevention videos that I just mentioned. We haven't we just this month are releasing them. So it's brand new, and we have plans to expand it out, and I think it would be great if we can expand it more to adult projects soon. But right now it's mostly peers of adolescents. But there are some really good resources out there for responding to harassment. There is a group called Hollaback, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but let me find their link. And I'm going to put the link to Hollaback in the chat. And they have a lot of trainings on bystander intervention. And I know that that's something that they do have trainings available online and through Zoom. And so maybe coordinating a Hollaback training is a really good option, or letting people know about that as a resource. They've also started a new project called Heart Mob. that I'm going to share with you. And Heart Mob is really cool because it's a place sponsored by Hollaback where you can go and users can sign up to offer support. And so then people can go and use that if they've received online harassment or unsolicited sexual imagery or any sort of digital harassment or abuse. They can go there and submit a report just to get support and encouragement from people who are there. And they can offer supportive words. They offer options for you to click to help them report it. So say it's on Instagram, you could put a link to the post where you're being harassed and people can go and report it for you. There are people, so there's options for the supporters to take action. So between the trainings on what to do in places of online bullying and harassment, which we also can do with NCCASA, we have some good information around that, but Hollaback is sort of like the gold standard on anti-harassment training. Between that and then the iheartmob.org website, where you can go and actually engage in sharing and receiving support. That's one strategy that can be helpful, one organization.
Yeah, I've never heard of those two links before, so I definitely gonna check it out because like I said, I do have soldiers that are just barely adults, and they're still with the new age that you guys mentioned earlier. They're all about online, especially now that COVID, and they just graduated high school last May, and they're now in a new environment, away from family and all that stuff. So they don't have that support that they would normally have, and that's us looking out for them pretty much. So, and I do agree with the conversations that you guys had earlier too, where it's not all about stranger dangers, because a lot of the times family members are like, hey, that's the way of them reaching out, so other family members don't see the harassment or the assault or anything, like kind of low key their grooming ways and all that.
Yeah, it's very easy for these digital interactions to become just an extension. They end up becoming just yet another forum in which the harassment or abuse can happen. And I might want to look into some more resources for military, because that is an area where I'm not as strong, because I'm thinking with those 18 and 19-year-olds, we have so much training around campus work. And I know that at NCCASA, we've been doing a lot of work with HBCUs, and that we also are doing a needs assessment right now for community colleges to make sure we're reaching young folks in community colleges who may not be at major universities. But you're right, that military age group often does have young folks in that same age bracket who need some extra support.
If anybody else has any questions, definitely feel free to unmute yourself, or like I had said before, if you're more comfortable putting in the chat, I'm definitely happy to read those out for everybody. Right, well, we can stay in the space for a little bit longer if anybody has any questions. I know I'm more of a processor, so I know it takes me a little bit of time sometimes to kind of think through what I want to ask. But I wanted to say thank you so much again to Chris for your time and for sharing all of the incredible work that you've done. I know that you have made NCCASA an incredibly great organization, and honestly, the work that you do, I don't know how you do it. You do so much. So thank you again so much. And like I said, we'll be staying in the space for a little bit longer if anybody wants to ask any more questions, or both about the Let's Talk About It campaign or online consent and boundaries. Yeah, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Ooh, okay. So we do have a chat question that I did want to address. And so someone in the chat is asking, is there any advice on feeling comfortable on social media while previous harassers keep trying to contact you? And that's a very common experience and very frightening. And the thing is, part of the harassment and the abuse, part of the point of it is to keep you feeling uncertain and unsteady, like you can't control when that's coming into your field or when that's going to happen to you. So what I would say is take whatever steps you need to take to feel safe in that setting. And so check your settings. It's fine to block people, block and report. Like I am so liberal with the block button. I block people for being mean to me. I've gotten to the point where if there's some people to where when I see them come up in my comments and I just feel that anxious feeling, I'm like, I don't owe anybody my mental health. Block, right? Or hide them. So definitely don't feel like you owe anyone access to you. I feel like sometimes on social media we can trick ourselves into thinking that like we owe people access to us, that we have to stay connected to people who we don't even like because they added us and we don't want to reject them. And people will take advantage of that, right? And that'll keep giving keeping you exposed to people who are harassing you. So block, change your settings. And sometimes that can be frustrating because there may be things you want to share publicly, or you may, if you're on Twitter, for example, that people can't retweet it if you have a private account and have it seen publicly. But sometimes it's a trade-off you make to keep yourself safe. So do the things you need to do to cut off that contact and keep that access limited. And if there's any harassment that crosses a line, then you can report it if there's any kind of abuse. And I'll be honest, having done advocate work, that sometimes in terms of feeling comfortable, sometimes comfortable is just relative. I'm going to be honest that there may be situations where you take the best steps that you can and you do the best things that you can to keep yourself safe, and you report anything that crosses any boundaries or any of the rules, right? If it's a violation of one of the rules of the platform you're on, and you set your settings the best you can, and there may still be some discomfort that comes up sometimes, especially if you have mutual friends with people who are also friends with people who are harassing you. So the best guidance I can give you on that is to report it if it violates a rule, and then be very very generous with yourself about like setting every boundary you need. It's okay for you to shut down your profile, to be really selective about who you let see you, to unfriend people who make you uncomfortable. If there's someone who's a mutual friend who you're scared is going to be sharing information about your private life you don't want, you can either unfriend them or add them to I know on Facebook you can add them to a list where they can't see certain posts. Just like minimize their opportunities to harass you. Yeah,
I definitely agree with what you had said about, even if it's just somebody that like you get kind of icky vibes from when you see it. Like I know for me after high school, I felt this obligation to keep these people connected and like let them see what was going on in my life. And that just like isn't true. Like we don't really need to do that. If it doesn't, for me, like if it doesn't fill my cup and if they don't, make me happy, then why should I let them kind of have insights into like what my personal life is like? So I think that's a really good reminder for us to have, that it's okay to just kind of remove people that make us uncomfortable or icky.
Like I don't owe anybody my mental health. That's one of my favorite phrases about my online engagements, is I don't owe anybody my mental health. So if someone is engaging with me online in a way that makes me feel anxious or sad or overwhelmed, or I don't need that. And sometimes it may be that I set that boundary, and maybe this is maybe not the same as a harasser, but there may be some people where I set that boundary and unfriend them on social media so that I can still be nice to them when I see them in public, right? I've had to do that with some family members, where it's like, I'm okay seeing you at the family reunions and at grandma's house, but I don't want to see your social media feed anymore. It stresses me out. That's an acceptable whatever boundaries you need. you're allowed to set, right? And if someone's like, why did you unfriend me? You don't even have to reply to that if you don't want to, right? You get to control how you respond to those situations.
Yeah, I think that's a really great response and a really great thing to kind of keep in mind. I love that phrase, is that you don't owe anybody else your mental health. I think that's like something really, really great that people should internalize, because it's true.
Yeah, it's mine and I protect it to the extent that I'm able, right? And I know that, we can't always protect our sense of wellness. But to the extent that I can cut out things that impact things and people and words and conversations that impact me, that I can't control, I block it. There's a difference between sitting with discomfort because you're learning and growing, or like challenging a long held belief that you need to challenge, and having someone who's just really harassing you and making you uncomfortable.
And Chris, this is just me thinking off the top of my head, and I don't know if you know the answer to it. Are there any additional steps or actions that people can take if there is somebody that, for example, if it's a repeated harasser, like if it's somebody who just creates like different profiles to just like continually try to like get in contact with you and disrupt your space? Are there any additional steps somebody can take besides just blocking them?
So there are a lot of different websites, and the Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and most social media, on the page where you talk about reporting harassment and what to report and how, it also gives you other steps that you can usually take, because there are certain kinds of online harassment that actually could be reported to law enforcement if reporting to law enforcement is something that someone was interested in. So certain things do cross into a line where it needs, it could have a law enforcement report. And also, we know there's a lot of reasons why, even with things at that level, people might not want to report to law enforcement. So for those who don't want to, or for situations that don't necessarily meet something that, it's not a definition of something that needs law enforcement involvement, there's community-based responses. And so again, Hollaback has some really good bystander intervention trainings on how to disrupt bullying and harassment through online bystander intervention. We may see that some of the principles, again, if we think about the idea of taking things we're doing in our everyday lives, in our 3D real world lives, and applying them to online, well, then we might look at some of the transformative justice practices that we use. And some of those are where you rely on community to help hold people accountable. And again, finding that fine line between relying on community to help hold someone accountable for harassing you without becoming a harasser yourself means you need to be engaging the right kind of people who can hold that person accountable and reach out and be like, hey, that's not acceptable, without becoming the next mob that's going after that person, right? So thinking about how you can creatively engage community and mutual friends to hold people compassionately accountable, and firmly accountable when they need that too.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's definitely something that I've always been curious about like what you can do beyond just blocking somebody. But again, I really can't thank you enough for your time and sharing everything with us. I truly appreciate it. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this time. I'll let you go 10 minutes early, maybe go take a walk outside. If you're not allergic to pollen, of course, since it is pollen time again here. But yeah, thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, y'all.